welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome our at the Philosophical Cafe, our Friday evening discussions. And I was surprised to realize today that this is the 30th edition of our Philosophical Cafe, which began as a lockdown project back in March and has grown ever since. For those of you who are joining for the first time, we are doing alternative sessions. 1 week we are doing things in Romanian, the other week we are doing things in English, and we are broadcasting on YouTube. We are live on YouTube at the moment. You can ask questions, and we are going to introduce your questions into the discussion. So tonight at the Philosophical Cafe, we are going to speak about one of the most puzzling philosophers of all times. Someone who, I think, demonstrated how one's life and one's writing can go hand in hand without contradiction. And this is something very rare indeed. Someone who not only advocated a philosophical life, a life according to the dictates of reason, but seemed to have lived such a life. For all that we know, because one has the feeling when reading Spinoza or reading about Spinoza, that there are still things we do not know about him. And there are certainly several things we still do not understand about his work, at least if we consider the extent of the scholarship on Spinoza that is produced year after year. Scholars really believe that there is something there that still needs to be brought to light, interpreted, and discussed. We have tonight with us two distinguished guests who are working on Spinoza. And the subject, the discussion will be centered on a new book, a book by Stephen Nadler called Think List of Death, Spinoza on How to Live and How to Die. Right. Welcome to the Philosophical Cafe, Steve.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Dana.
And it's very good to have you here. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And our second guest is also someone who has worked a lot and for a long time on Spinoza, Professor Daniel Garber. Dan, welcome to the Philosophical Cafe.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to begin our discussion.
Beg your pardon.
Yes, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think I'm going to be moderating this, but I consider Steve to be the sort of central guest. And while there may be many things...
Let me begin by asking both of you a question. May I?
Sure.
Because I've been wondering, and this is a direct and personal question. You know, what is the appeal of Spinoza for you? Scholars entering the field of Spinoza studies seem to stay there for a long time. Some are even disappearing there for decades. And Stephen Adler, this is your fourth book about Spinoza, if I count it correctly. I've been trying to count, and I was wondering whether I did get to the right number. And what set you work on Spinoza, and why is Spinoza so interesting and so important that how can we relate to this? That this is such a fantastic subject that keeps one busy for decades and decades and decades, and for many books. What would you answer to this question?
Dan, should I go first?
Yeah, why don't you go first?
Okay. It's a great question because one might think that I've become obsessed with Spinoza, which, although I think that's true of most people who work on Spinoza, we tend to get obsessed with him. In my case, they're both personal and philosophical reasons. The philosophical reasons are easy to spell out, for me at least, because I think Spinoza basically got it all right. As much as I enjoy working on other philosophers, Descartes, Malebranche, and Leibniz, and others, with them, I don't feel like I'm working on somebody who basically got it all right, but just somebody who poses some really interesting philosophical questions in intriguing ways in a particularly interesting historical period. With Spinoza, though, his views on God, his views on religion and politics, his account of human nature and his moral philosophy seemed to me really to be philosophical views that one could still adopt today and live by. You know, walking down the street, you're not going to run to a lot of people who are Leibnizians or Cartesians. But I think, you know, throw a stone and you're likely to hit a Spinozist today. The personal reasons go way back to when I was a graduate student, not because I was working on Spinoza at the time, but because I was writing a dissertation on Antoine Arnauld, a 17th century Jansenist thinker, and Descartes. And I was having a Shabbat dinner at my sister's apartment. She's an ultra-Orthodox Jew, and her rabbi was there. And he asked me what I was working on, and I told him, and he said, "Why are you working on all those Goyish philosophers?" And even though it didn't immediately change my dissertation topic, it led me to, that question was always at the back of my mind. And then after getting tenure, I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to write on a topic that bore somehow on my own Jewish heritage? And wouldn't it also be interesting to write something that got read by more than 12 other people? And I noticed that Spinoza, I could continue to work on early modern philosophy. I could work on a Jewish topic, and I could write something that would get read by a broader audience, like a biography, which had never been done. So for me, Spinoza, that biography of Spinoza is the gift that keeps on giving, because just getting started on Spinoza, you find these endless rabbit holes, endless questions that you think you understand, and the more you read Spinoza, the more you realize the less you understand.
Then how would you answer to this question?
Well, first of all, let me react to a couple of things. I mean, Steve's biography really is wonderful, and I recommend it to everybody. Dana, you said that, you know, there are many things about Spinoza that we don't understand. Well, we may not understand them, but I think Steve understands a lot of them.
There's
a lot of them. And
hopefully at the end of the evening we will all understand more.
Yes, but as far as his the story about the rabbi, a number of years ago, when our family joined a Reform congregation, Jewish congregation in Chicago, the rabbi asked what I was doing. And I said, among other things, I was working on Spinoza at the time. His response was, "We excommunicated him and he deserved it." So, which is another reason for studying Spinoza. Now, years ago, I had a colleague, Alan Donegan, and this is before I had read Spinoza, but I must admit, I had read Spinoza, taught Spinoza for roughly 15 years before I really got a sense of why it is that it was interesting and important. It was something I had to do as part of a course on the so-called continental rationalists, but it was enormously difficult for me. And I read a book by my colleague, Alan Donegan at University of Chicago. And
you were Aquinian back then, weren't you?
No, it's more complicated than that. I was actually writing on Descartes and Leibniz at that time, but I was interested in all sorts of contemporary philosophy that I've since moved on from. But in any case, Donegan in the preface said the reason why he studies Spinoza is very much like what Steve said, because ultimately he is, of all the philosophers, the one who is closest to being right. And I read that and I thought to myself, this is crazy. How could this possibly be true? But after, my conversion to Spinozism, well, yes and no conversion, but after I think I understood better what it is that was going on and understood the attractiveness, I think there's something right about that. And while there are certainly ways in which I do disagree with Spinoza still, there is a great deal that is illuminating, defensible, and worth defending. But let's begin the conversation. Steve, would you like to begin by talking a little bit about, I take it that I'm supposed to be doing kind of the moderation and
actually, I think I will do the moderation and you will quarrel with Steve.
We need some
Or not quarrel, but
too.
I was going to suggest that it might be helpful for Steve to say a little bit about what it is that he's doing in the book.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Begin with for the audience.
Well, and I keep saying this will be my last book on Spinoza, but who knows? So in this book, I thought I really wanted to dig more deeply into Spinoza as a moral philosopher, which seems to still be an area of Spinoza that's understudied. We have plenty of rich studies on his metaphysics and his epistemology, and there's great work being done on his political thought, and there will continue to be great work done in all those areas. But I'd say it's only within the last 10 years or so that people have begun to take Spinoza seriously as a moral thinker. And I was always struck by the fact that Alan Ryan, in his two-volume history of political thought, didn't even include a chapter on Spinoza, and I think Spinoza is nowhere even mentioned in that book. So that shows us that there's still a lot of work to be done with Spinoza as a political thinker. But it was the moral philosophy that really attracted me, because here I think, even if you disagree with some of the things that Spinoza says, including his theory of human motivation and the egoism, it's a really rich, complex moral philosophy, and especially given the fact that starting with a premise about the egoistic motivation behind human behavior, Spinoza somehow is able to derive ways of treating other human beings that respect their own well-being and in fact require us to act to improve the lives of others. And then there was also a great deal of discussion of what exactly is Spinoza's ideal human being, the free person or the free man, if we want to translate the Latin literally. And I thought it would be interesting to have some clarity on just what is the free man supposed to be, and what role is this person, this ideal person, supposed to play in guiding our lives. I know Dan and I have had different views on this, and there's a plurality of views on what exactly the free man is doing in Spinoza's thought. And finally, I wanted to look in greater detail at all of the different virtues and ways of acting that characterize the life of the free person. They often get summarily discussed in this or that introduction of Spinoza, and maybe one virtue or another gets discussed in an article here or there. But I wanted to put all of these virtues together, the virtue of rationality, generosity, benevolence, and so on, and see how they together constitute not just a good life, but the good life, that is the life that human beings should strive for. And so I hope that my book, even though it doesn't take a lot for granted, especially prior knowledge of Spinoza, I hope that it puts the moral philosophy both in the context of Spinoza's more general thought, but also depicts Spinoza's moral philosophy as a guide both to living and a guide to dying, literally. That is, how are we to live a good life? How are we to achieve happiness? But also, what is the proper attitude to take towards our mortality and the mortality of others?
I say something that somehow I haven't so far, I haven't felt the pull of getting into Spinoza studies until I read your book. And actually, first of all, I liked the book very much. But what I liked about the book is the way you built its central character, the free man. And the way you leave the reader thinking, how much of this is Spinoza? In the line of my introduction, that here is a philosopher who really did what he preached, who really lived the kind of life that he preached, which you cannot say about other philosophers. So I would like, Steve, if you can, to talk a bit more about the free man. So one thing someone who is not a Spinozist is struck with, and you also actually emphasize this in your book, is how interestingly similar and at the same time how vastly different is this free man from the Stoic sage, for example. A very cursory glance into what is a free man. Well, a free man is someone who lives according to the dictates of reason, would send the inattentive reader to someone like, Seneca or Epictetus, whose sage lives according to the dictates of reason. So how is your free man, Spinoza's free man, different from the age-old ideal of the sage?
Let me first address the first thing you said about Spinoza's philosophy and his life, because it's an interesting one. We know so little about Spinoza's life, and in fact, one of the few episodes we do have some testimony about shows him, in fact, to have not really always lived according to the guidance of reason. When the Witt brothers were torn apart by a mob in 1672, being suspected of treason and really an angry mob after the French invasion of the Netherlands. Spinoza was tempted to run out of his landlord's house in The Hague and accost this mob and accuse them of being barbarians. Unfortunately, Spinoza's landlord was able to stop him from this intemperate behavior, because surely Spinoza would have been torn apart himself, I think. But on the other hand, I do get the sense, despite the lack of all documentary evidence, that Spinoza himself was a person of not just great charisma, but equanimity, peace of mind, and sort of a wise ability to deal honestly with the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And even Bayle, who is no fan of Spinoza's, says that at least with Spinoza, we have some evidence that an atheist can live a virtuous life. So I do think you're right, Dana, that we can think of Spinoza as somebody who at least tried to live as closely as possible to this ideal. The free man, as I see it, and this is something that I think Dan and I can certainly discuss, I think the free man for Spinoza is not an impossible ideal, some kind of hyper-rational asymptote that we can strive to approximate but never actually achieve. I think the free man for Spinoza is identical with the individual who consistently lives according to the dictates of reason. That is, whose choices and decisions and actions are based not so much on the passions and how this person is made to feel by this or that experience, but rather, despite having passions, the free man always does what reason dictates, what reason commands them to do. And here I think I depart from some other depictions of the free man. I think the free man is subject to passions. The free man, as simply a person who lives according to the guidance of reason, is a human being. And like all human beings, is necessarily a part of nature. And to be a part of nature means that you will suffer passions. You will stub your toe. You will get paper cuts on your fingers. You will also feel sadness at times when a loved one passes away, and you will feel joy, a passive joy, perhaps at the birth of a child. The difference between the free man and the person who is enslaved by the passions is that despite feeling these passions and being subject to them, the free man never lets them guide his or her life. The free man's decisions are determined by what reason dictates. So the free man is in control of themselves. They are not in control of the objects outside of them. To this extent, and there's no such thing as the Stoic sage, but rather different Stoic depictions of the ideal life of the sage. I do think that to the extent that the Stoic sage is either free of the passions or can exercise control over the passions through dispassionate reason. I think in that sense, Spinoza's free person is not the Stoic sage, because the free person is, while in control of their passions, it's not because reason has clear and distinct or adequate ideas. It's not the truth of what reason perceives that allows the free person to control the passions, but the affective power of reason. So the mind of the free person is sort of an agonistic arena where affects are clashing with affects. It's just that for the free person, unlike the enslaved person, the affective power of reason is stronger than the affective power of the passions. And so this person will not be subject to akrasia, to weakness or incontinence. They will always do what reason commands. And to that extent, I think Spinoza's free person is quite, while inspired by the sage as depicted by Seneca or Epictetus, I think there are interesting differences in either the total freedom from passion, from externally generated emotions, or from the way in which those emotions are controlled. But on the other hand, there are great similarities, because part of the insights of the free person is that nature is governed by a necessity beyond one's own control. And that rather than striving to control things that you cannot possibly do, you should control those things that are within your power. And these are, to some degree, states of mind, attitudes, and beliefs.
Can I come in here on this question and introduce a bit of a complexity and something that I think might be interesting to talk about? And this is in a certain way another Stoic idea. That one of the important features of Spinoza's philosophy is that everything, including human beings, but not only human beings, strives for self-preservation. This is a basic principle for Spinoza's conception of the human being, and in fact, what it is that is a driving idea in his ethics and his politics, is that everybody strives for self-preservation. Now, this is in a certain sense. Oh, by the way, I do find, Steve, your account of the free man to be very compelling. I'm not sure that Spinoza consistently takes this as opposed to other views of the free man, but I think it is a very compelling view, and certainly very defensible. But thinking about this striving towards self-preservation, there's another contemporary philosopher, contemporary to Spinoza, who also thinks about human beings in this way, and that's Hobbes. But for Hobbes, the striving for self-preservation, and for that matter, the rational striving for self-preservation, leads to conflict of all against all in the state of nature. Very different.
Sources are very scarce.
And the idea that it's only, I mean, for Hobbes, it is only through the external control of a sovereign that we choose to sort of enforce rules of rationality, that we're able to live together. And as soon as the civil state, which is under the control of the sovereign, dissolves, we're back in the state of conflict with one another. Why is it that Spinoza uses something very similar to Hobbes's principle of striving for self-preservation? Why is it that in Spinoza and Hobbes, we get such different results from the same starting place?
That's a great question. Although I wonder, so let me first, to give myself a chance to think about that, let me put a question back to you. For Hobbes, yes, the egoistic striving for self-preservation in the state of nature leads to conflict, but it also leads to cooperation and the generation of the social contract. And so there is a positive outcome. It may be that they're not that far apart. And even for Hobbes, the motivation for entering into that social community is not just security, but at times Hobbes seems to think the generation of culture, of the improvement of people's lives,
yeah.
not just the preservation of those lives. So I wonder how far apart they really are. I mean, I think Hobbes has a more pessimistic view of human nature, but at the same time, perhaps sees the ultimate outcome of this striving not that far from Spinoza's. Do you think?
I think that the two of them are very closely related to one another. And Hobbes read the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, but I don't know how much he reflected on Spinoza's political theory. Spinoza definitely did read Hobbes, and you can see that all over. One thing that is very, very different is I think that for Hobbes, we need the external control always of a sovereign who is basically the enforcer. People by their nature will strive. Well, let me see how to put this. Without that control, people will return to the state of nature, I think, for Hobbes. But there's something different that's going on, I think, with Spinoza. And I'm wondering if we can put our fingers on why it is that Spinoza gets such a different result.
Yeah. Without that sovereign control,
May I just jump in just a moment to say that perhaps it would be useful to go beyond a particular debate between two philosophers and just try to generalize and understand what the problem is, because maybe the problem is more general than what Hobbes or Spinoza said. And it's also, I can also see its Stoic roots if we want to see the roots of the problem. And that's a big conflict between this tendency of self-preservation, which is understood by many philosophers in terms of an inner impulse, irresistible impulse, and the need to live together in a society, which had all sorts of names during history of philosophy, and philosophers tried to sort out various ways in which these two conflicting tendencies were kept in some sort of balance, because after all, we do need to live in a society. So Hobbes proposed external control to keep us in our places. What did Spinoza argue for?
So, and this, I can use, here's how I think I might put it, both in response to Dana's question and Dan's. I see a kind of recursive thing going on in Spinoza. Were you to remove the sovereign authority and put people back in a state of nature, what would happen is that they would reconstruct a sovereign authority, because that's where reason would lead them. Their impulse, their rational impulse for self-preservation, even their passionate impulse for self-preservation. And I wonder if the same is not true for Hobbes. If you remove the sovereign, you'll create a situation of conflict, but simply a recurrence of the coming to a contractual or a covenant establishing a society. I don't think, as far as I can tell, neither thinker would think that were you to remove the sovereign by revolution or by divine fiat or however it happens, that you would end up in a permanent state of nature. I think you just have a recursion of that initial covenantal coming together of people.
Do you think for Spinoza, people are fundamentally social? See, Hobbes says no.
Yeah,
the reason, Dana, I'm putting it in terms of Spinoza versus Hobbes is in a certain sense, yes, they're two individual philosophers, but they represent, I think, alternative conceptions of human nature and alternative conceptions of how to think about sociability, how to think about politics.
Dan, I think, wouldn't they be necessarily social on Spinoza's view?
Beg your pardon?
Wouldn't they be necessarily social on Spinoza's view? Social by necessity?
Everything's by necessity for Spinoza.
That's true.
There you go.
Bill, what do you mean by social by necessity?
Oh, that's just what I meant. Yeah, that's Stephen got it.
So I think what's interesting is that I think, Dan, to put it the way you did is good. I think that captures a good difference between them. Even the free man, who you would think would have a kind of self-sufficiency, and this goes back to an article Dan wrote some time ago on the Dr. Feichelson, the Isaac Bashevis Singer character. I think even Spinoza's free man will necessarily have social impulses, will not retreat from sociability, but will strive for it necessarily, both because they will see that their own self-interest, their own preservation is aided by the social situation. And then Spinoza explicitly notes that the free man is freer in a social and political context than is all by himself. So the free man should not be thought of as an austere hermit, self-sufficient on his own, but necessarily seeking out the company of others and striving to make them as rational as he is. I think it very much like what Socrates says in the Apology. Remember that when Socrates is accused of corrupting his fellow citizens, and his response to that is, well, what do you think I am, an idiot? If I am corrupting my fellow citizens, I would have to live among corrupt people. And am I that stupid that I would want to live among corrupt people? And I think that's precisely the attitude of the free man in Spinoza.
We have a lot of questions, so let's take some of them. But before taking questions, I would like people to phrase them as less scholarly as they can. Since this is not a discussion among Spinozists, and we want to avoid our public leaving because they feel they don't belong here. So let's try to translate the questions in as general terms as possible. And there are all sorts of interesting questions. So I think, by the way, because it's somehow they are relating each other, I would like Noah Shine to start and then perhaps Sheen Butler to continue. Noah, if you want to ask your question.
What I was wondering, Steve, if you could say a little bit more what you take the self to be, that we're striving to persevere, and that might also shed light on the difference between Hobbes and Spinoza, because if they took the self to be different, that would also explain how those things diverge.
I know, it's a great question, and it's a difficult question because as Dan and I have discussed before, the Spinoza's philosophy does not begin with a cogito, with the self. So what is, or who is, or what is striving to preserve itself? And it is a particular ratio of motion and rest, a particular proportion of motion and rest among parcels of extension, or particles of extension, as well as the mental correlate of that parcel of extension, which is the mind. Now that's a very technical way of putting it, but I think essentially what's striving to preserve itself is the person, and that person is individuated from other persons, distinguished from other persons by virtue of being a striving. So what makes you and me different is not just that you're in Israel and I'm in the United States, but that we are in this sort of, again, I will use the term agonistic relationship, that you're a parcel of power and I'm a parcel of power. And even with your best intentions, your parcel of power is opposed to mine. Just like my parcel of power is opposed to all of the parcel of powers that are surrounding me. Gravity is pulling me down, pulling me apart, and I'm striving to resist that. So as difficult as it is, I think, to really pinpoint the principle of individuation for Spinoza, what makes an individual, I think the answer has to lie in that doctrine of striving, the conatus, because that's what I am. I am a striving. And that striving manifests itself both in the physical integrity of my body and in my psychological life, the power of my thoughts to move and to reflect what's happening to my body. Dan, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, Donna, you were about to say something. I think you're absolutely right. But let me throw in another question. Both, the Spinoza's version of this and the Hobbesian version of this, and I take these to be sort of archetypes for sort of different views of human nature and different views of how it is that it fits in with politics. They both realize that, of course, there are certain things that are rational and certain things that are irrational. There are certain passions and that are opposed to reason and so on. But one of the differences, I think, is in the attitude of toward reason. There's a sense in which, for Spinoza, part of this striving towards self-preservation involves striving to become more and more rational. And the more rational we are, the stronger this striving is. Hobbes, I think, does not. We do have rationality. There are certain things that are rational, like, for example, coming together to form a civil state in which we can live more comfortably, in which we can live more safely. But at the same time, he also realizes that these are overcome often by passions, and that rationality is very fragile. Which is more realistic? The Spinoza's view is certainly very attractive. I think we all want to think that we're like that the more rational we are, the more rational we'll become. But there's also an attraction, I think, to the more realistic view of Hobbes, that, as nice as it would be to think of ourselves as these sort of increasingly rational people, maybe we're not.
In today's political climate, it's really hard to sustain the optimistic vision of Spinoza, I think, on the rationality. We're all striving to become rational. At least 49% of us seem these days not to be, judging from the recent election.
And I mean, thinking about the difference between, what happens in the state, when we go back to the state of nature,
right.
between the two.
Which we were in for 4 years, essentially. Well, we had no functioning government.
Details of American politics. Not everybody in the audience is
okay.
involved with this as we may be over here. But I think that that's an interesting thing to think about. One of the things that drives Spinoza's view is this optimism about, yes, there are irrational people in the world, and Spinoza knew perfectly well, and that's the example of the political situation that you were talking about before, with the reaction against the DeWitt brothers. But there is an optimism that, people are striving toward becoming more and more rational. Not everybody can make it all the way, but that this, in a certain way, is where it is that sociability comes from. In Spinoza, we know that it's rational for us to behave well toward other people because we need other people. And we want to educate other people and help them become more rational so that they will cooperate with us, so that we will all mutually benefit. So it is all sort of an egoistic, that which is necessary to preserve my own existence. But on the other hand, reason enters in a way that makes us want to be with other people and want us to make other people want to be with us as well.
Even when Spinoza falls into a pessimistic mode, his distrust of the masses, the vulgar.
Yeah.
Even there, it's tempered by an optimism that they can be brought to moral behavior, if not by reason, then by edifying narratives, such as in the Bible. And that even they can be led towards treating others with justice and charity, not the way in which the very few philosophers can be, but at least in a way that reinforces the sociability that the philosopher pursues through reason.
Yep.
Let me try to simplify a bit what you said and maybe introduce another question and see whether, I mean, that's also in a way my question, to see whether I understand correctly what is the crux of the matter here. So what seems to be very interesting in your reconstruction of Spinoza, Steve, is that unlike other early modern philosophers, he naturalizes every strives and impulses that I have. And, you know, as you said, I'm a parcel of power. And this parcel of power has a number of manifestations, of which the strive to understand the world is one. And the strive to act according to the rules of reasons is also a part of it. As there are, as you said earlier, and here I want to introduce Sean Butler, the passions. So there are all these inner forces in me, and I'm the one who is called upon to kind of put them in some sort of balance and to understand that some are as powerful as the others. Did I understand you correctly? And then we might introduce the question.
Yeah, I think so. And this does relate nicely to Sean's question, and I like the way he puts it. His question, well, Sean, why don't you raise your question, and I'll
Sean, why don't you read the question loud?
Yeah, hi. So it seems to me that there's a tension between the lived passion that one experiences and then their rational state that needs to be reconciled somehow. And it seems like to me that perhaps the spontaneous acknowledgement of one's like modal existence in the present, and then the authentic accompanying of rational witness to that moment could possibly bear out a bridge that allows for passion and rationality to coexist. So that's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Well, so when I saw in your question the word authenticity and spontaneity, my first thought was that that's certainly a good way to characterize Spinoza's free person, that their choices and decisions and actions follow from what they know and not from how they feel and not how other things direct them. And that's certainly a kind of spontaneity and authenticity where you are directed by your nature and not by the nature of other things. But then the way in which you phrase the question as well, that the free person is able to achieve that state by, and let me paraphrase what I think you were saying, by coming to understand him or herself and their place in the world, and by negotiating that boundary. That is, I understand, I'm not led by illusions, for example, the illusion of free will, or what Spinoza calls the illusion of thinking that human beings are dominions within a dominion and somehow stand outside the laws of nature. And it's that kind of understanding of his or her place in nature that I think is key to the free person's freedom. And that too is a kind of authenticity. That is, they have an accurate assessment of who and what they are. And this leads to some of the virtues I discussed in the book. The virtue of the free person is not overly humble, but neither are they overly proud. They don't have false humility, but they're not arrogant because they have a correct and accurate assessment of what their power is. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Dan, would you like to add something here, or shall we take another question?
No, not on this. I'm actually looking at Omar Del Nono's question. Omar, would you like to pose your question?
But I think you answered partially before, actually. Now, my question was related with the fact that I read actually the Kiva 1 week ago, and I noticed the different. I had the impression that there were a big difference, a different position from how Hobbes understands the dictates of reason, because you can know these things, but you are not bound with these dictates. You don't have to act in this way. I don't remember which part is. While how I understood Spinoza, and that's so also really difficult, but it's also the fascinating thing is reason when he said in the fourth part that we always agree with nature and with other people. And actually, I don't want to say you have to act in this way, but it's different, because adequate determines your acting in this way than to sociability. And the reason for my question, I have the impression a different outcome is also related with this idea of rationality or reason, actually, the dictates of reason that are really important in both Spinoza and Hobbes. And this is my question, to clarify it, if you can.
It does seem that in Spinoza, reason has a kind of necessity that it doesn't have in other people. Like for example, Hobbes. Do you think that that's fair to say, Steve?
I do, yeah. And because Hobbes, in the state of nature, there's an element of fear that leads people, as well as the rational direction to form a society. But you don't see that in Spinoza. So it's not just in Hobbes, it's not just a rational decision to form a covenant, but it's one motivated by passions.
Well, I mean, what Spinoza will say is that, what Hobbes will say is that there are passions that are involved in forming the state. The fear is one of them. The desire, as he puts it, for commodious living is another one. Right. Living in the state of nature life in the state of nature is famously nasty, brutish, and short. Nobody likes living that way. So there is a sort of passion, but also there are dictates of reason, which he calls the laws of nature, which tell us that now they're basically laws that are connected with self-preservation. You can more effectively preserve yourself if you come together. You can more effectively preserve your continued existence if you come together, form a civil society, and live in that way under a sovereign. On the other hand, you never give up in a certain way your passions, and this is something important for Hobbes. And there are irrational passions. Well, they're not altogether irrational passions. But Hobbes says, for example, we all seek the approval of other people. We all seek glory. We want other people to think that we're swell. And this, in a certain way, is a rational thing to want, because if other people do think that we're wonderful and admire us, etc., then they will help us when we need help. Right, but this leads to conflict, and this leads to hurt feelings when other people don't estimate your worth as highly as you estimate your own, and so on. And those, even in the state of, in a civil state, don't go away. So even in a civil state, however rational, however compelling rational laws of nature may be, there are all of these other pressures that never go away, in a way in which they are eventually tamed, I think, for Spinoza.
Dan, do you think that for Hobbes, in the state of nature, if there weren't the passions of hope and fear, that reason would be sufficient to lead people towards a social covenant?
No.
But I think for Spinoza, they would. That is, in the absence of hope and fear, reason would be, well, just because for Spinoza, reason has its affective power, it could be sufficient to move people to form a polity.
Maybe it's time to introduce here Denis Dazic's question, which is relating to this and relates to the question how it is possible to be led by dictates of reason. Denis, if you want to ask your question.
Who, Dennis?
Who is this?
Who are you?
We lost Denis?
He can't.
Dennis Dagci?
He doesn't have a microphone.
He doesn't have a microphone.
Right. Okay. So let me just read his question. So the question is, where is it? There's a very sophisticated one and a reformulated one, and I'm going to read the reformulated one, which basically relates to how is it possible for an individual to be led solely by reason, even if one has inadequate ideas and is subject to passions?
So I think it depends upon which philosopher you are. I mean, if you're the account of weakness or incontinence that we find, let's say, in Plato, where reason is countered by very strong passions and affects, then I think we can wonder, how could reason ever have the strength or power to overcome the passions? I'm just thinking of the metaphor of the chariot from Phaedrus. How can the chariot ever make the black horse obey the white horse? For Spinoza, reason is affectively charged. And even if I have passionate affects, even if I have feelings of sadness and joy, pleasure and pain, even if I have hopes and fears, in the free person, the affective power of these passions is always going to be weaker than the affective power of my rational beliefs. It's as if as strongly, however strong my pain or sadness may be, it's in the free person, it's never going to be a match for and think of it, here's a sort of a metaphor feeling it. I don't just know what's right, I really know what's right. That is, I feel strongly about my knowledge that's what's right. And that gives that knowledge a kind of affective power stronger than the affective power of my passions. If I'm a free person.
It's true, but you're talking about the free person.
Yes, isn't that what the question's about?
It is, but the thing is, I mean, just to make the question more general, what about the rest of us who aren't so free?
The rest of us who aren't so free will have to struggle with that balance between the affective, between the rational affects and the passive affects or the passionate affects. But even these people, there's hope for them because there are ways of appealing to their passionate affects through the imagination and moving them not to be motivated by reason, but to do the things that reason asks us to do. So if reason commands us to treat other people with justice and charity, the philosophical type, the free person, will behave in that way with full understanding as to why they should behave in that way. But for the massive people who are incapable of that kind of rational understanding, they can still be led to do what reason commands. What Aristotle calls acting in accordance with reason, but not acting out of reason, by appealing to their imagination through the stories of the Bible, through Shakespeare. Remember that for Spinoza, a book is divine if it moves us towards truly pious behavior, towards ethical treatment of others. And in that respect, the Bible may or may not be divine for this, may be divine for this person and not divine for another person because it doesn't move that other person. But let's say that other person prefers reading Dickens or Jane Austen, or pick a novel, as opposed to the Bible, which for Spinoza is basically an anthology of novels. Pick a novel, and that novel will have the edifying effect on that person, not through reason, but through their imagination. So
let me just point out, Dennis has a reply, or something he wants to add to the discussion. Let me just read it out since he's mute. Being led solely by reason appears to imply that one is not led by reason as well as by other things, passive affects, not that the other things are weaker.
Being led solely by reason appears to imply that one is. No, I think just on the, I'm afraid I have to disagree with that. I think being led solely by reason implies that one is led by reason better than being led by other things. It doesn't mean you won't have passive affects. So unless I'm misunderstanding the question, I'm not sure why one would think that being led so, sorry.
Let me try just to rephrase this, if I understand correctly. Maybe we can make a step forward if we think in terms of how one does become a free man, because we are not born free, or maybe not all of us, or very few of us are born free men. So a very important part of your book is about, let's call it education or philosophical training, or philosophy as a way of life, a very popular theme nowadays, through which Spinoza thinks, perhaps, or at least you think that he thinks, then we can follow a model, an inner model, that will lead us to become a free person. So how is this done?
It's done through the kinds of therapeutic exercises that you see in the propositions of part 5. By and here too, I think it's a nice analogy with the ancient Stoics, that you train your mind in various ways. So for example, let's say I become deeply upset over the betrayal of a friend, and all of my energy is focused on that friend and their betrayal. But once I realize that the friend's betrayal is simply one node in an infinite causal series, my sense of betrayal, or my hurt, my anger, becomes diffuse, it becomes dispersed, and thereby weakened. It's no longer focused like a laser on this one person, but becomes affectively spread out over many things. And thus I can gain some kind of control over the strength of that feeling. Now, Dennis's questions says that being led solely by, and this will, I think this also help answer Dana's question. Being led solely by reason appears to imply that one is not led by reason as well as by other things. I think the free person is not led by other things despite having affective reactions to those other things, that they're not free of the passions, but through the therapeutic exercises that Spinoza recommends, with the model of human nature, that exemplar, before their mind, they can learn the various ways in which they become gradually more and more like that individual. I think here too, Spinoza has the same challenge that Aristotle has in his ethics. Aristotle says, well, how do I become I want to become a virtuous person. How do I do that? Well, you got to find a virtuous person and then start acting like a virtuous person. And eventually you'll acquire the habit of virtue, just the way in which Pascal says, how do I become a believer in God? Well, first you got to act like a believer, and then eventually you'll become a believer. I know that trivializes Pascal's remarks, but essentially that's what it comes to. For Spinoza, he doesn't have the problem that Aristotle has, because you don't have to go out looking for the virtuous person, because reason presents you with this model of a virtuous person. Now, I know Dan thinks that, in fact, the model of the free man is the product not so much of reason, but of the imagination. I think it's a product of reason, because it is a clear and adequate understanding of what a human both is and is necessarily striving to be. And even though some of the details of the life of reason may have to have some kind of imaginative formulation, I think every human being, by virtue of being rational, necessarily is striving to be the free person, whether they realize it or not. And then the question is,
may I just
Steve,
say
here's another strategy. I just want to.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to continue this for a moment. I agree with you completely. Here's another imaginative strategy for getting people to behave in a way that would be rational. Suggest that they create this imaginative conception of an anthropomorphic God who commands us to love our neighbor as ourselves, and who will punish us with eternal damnation if we don't, but reward us with eternal happiness if we do. That's an imaginative construct. That idea of loving our neighbor as ourselves is exactly what it is that reason tells us.
Yep.
Why isn't this just as good as imagining thinking of the model of the free man?
Because it's unstable. The same way in which you wouldn't want, I think
that's exactly what it is that Spinoza recommends in the Tractatus Theologica.
No, absolutely right. I didn't say it wasn't a good thing for the masses of people. They really have no alternative but to use their imagination. But here's why it's not as good. First of all, it's unstable. The same way in which Kant thought that ethical behavior based on inclination and emotion was unstable. You don't want to be surrounded by people who will only do good when they're moved to do so by their inclinations. You want them when they're moved by reason, despite their inclinations. But the other reason why it's less preferable is because, as you described it, it's a life enslaved to the passions of hope and fear. And this is a life of bondage. And it may be that the best most people can hope for is a life of bondage, but maybe a little less bondage. It's starting to sound a little erotic. Maybe a little less bondage than the life where it's hope of eternal reward and fear of eternal punishment. So maybe there's a less. I wonder if there are lessons you can get out of the Bible, which appeal not so much to hope and fear, not so much to hope and fear, but hope. That is, you take their models of moral behavior in the biblical narratives, which inspire you through the imagination, but without elevating the passions of hope and fear. I'm not quite sure what the answer to that question is, but it comes to mind.
I want to come back to hope and fear later, but there are a couple of questions I think maybe that we should.
But let me just try to push this a bit further, because again, I see Spinoza here as solving a very old problem that we all know. And in a way, it's solving it in a revolutionary manner, because the old problem is, how do I become better? Well, the traditional philosophical question, as you said, is find someone who is wise, find someone who is better, and imitate that person. Try to become like Socrates. Or, try to become like Jesus for that matter. Now, what you're saying is that Spinoza is proposing to this very traditional answer, which has its shortcomings because I do not know how to become like Socrates, Socrates being unique. I do not in what respects to follow the model of Socrates. Again, Socrates having all sorts of features, and that was one of the big problems of the philosophers, such as the Stoics. Which features of the wise do I imitate? How do I become like the wise? Now you are saying that Spinoza is saying that, well, it's very easy to do that because we actually can reach an inner model of rationality without looking outside us in any way. Is that true? And do you see it as a revolutionary? I mean, it doesn't seem like a traditional question, traditional answer at all.
No, I think that's right. Although you could argue that what we're looking at is God, Spinoza's God, who is free in a sense that we cannot possibly achieve, but is, sort of the model of perfect freedom. But actually, Dan, can I suggest a friendly amendment to what you said? You said he's trying to answer the oldest problem, is that how do I become good? Let me suggest that in fact, there's an even older problem, which comes before that question is, why be good? Why should I won't want to know how to be good until I first answer the question, why should I be good? And to this, Spinoza, I think, has an answer, namely, you can't help but want to be good. You can't help but want to be a better person. That is, you can't help but want to be an individual human being that is of greater power, who flourishes in the way in which he describes. That, to me, that's a really interesting question in ethics. The question of acrasia, of weakness, is a fascinating one. Why do I ever fail to be good? But an equally interesting and relevant question is not so much why do people fail to be good, but why do people fail to be motivated to be good? And I think to that, Spinoza has an interesting set of answers.
Yeah, Diego Dona has just raised an interesting question that's directly connected with this. Diego, would you like to pose your question?
Audio. Yes. Yes, Dan, it's the last question. I still think that there is a gap, in a way, between nature and politics, given the fact that first, notions like good and evil only arise after men enter society. So I just wonder if such artificial, so to speak, creation of notion like good and evil or right and wrong reveal a gap between the natural state of man, driven by conatus, and the rational state of society. And moreover, Spinoza says in TP that any government will be threatened more by its own citizen than by external enemies, which means to me that the dimension of conflicts still remains as a risk, as a possibility within society.
Thank you for that question. Let me address at least the first part. I think for Spinoza, it's important to distinguish between the notions of good and bad and the notions of just and unjust. Just and unjust only arise within society when there's a sovereign and there are civil laws. In my view, and this is, I think there's a variety of views on this. In my view, for Spinoza, there is good and bad outside of society. In fact, I think for Spinoza, there are objective conditions of good and bad. Not that there are absolute and intrinsic goodness and badness in things. Nothing is good or bad in itself. And notice I'm using the word bad rather than evil, because evil has theological connotations. Moral connotations. Things are good, objectively good, not in themselves, as far as they aid the striving of individuals. And things are bad, objectively bad, not in themselves, but insofar as they detract from an individual's flourishing or well-being. And that's going to be the case either within society or even in a state of nature.
I agree with that. I think also the first part of, or the second part of Diego's question is very, very interesting, whether within a society,
the conatus is stronger in a way.
What?
Even within the society, the conatus is stronger anyway.
Well, you're contrasting.
Problem in a,
But Diego, you're contrasting conatus with reason, whereas there's not a conatus doesn't stand opposed to reason, because conatus can express itself through reason as well as it can through the passions. The question is, where is conatus stronger? Is it stronger in its rational dimension, rational expression, or in its passionate expression?
So Steve, is conatus what you would call the resulting force of all these strives?
I would say it is the force of striving.
But they are clearly contrasting and conflicting forces within the parcel of power that I am. So do you see what you call the conatus as a sort of composite resulting force?
I suppose you could. I mean, perhaps yeah, I see the complexity there. So the ultimate outcome will be what it is I end up doing. And whether I end up doing it actively as a result of reason, or I end up doing it passively as a result of the passions. So I think of the conatus as this constant striving or force that is being pushed and pulled by different aspects of my nature.
And sometimes by things outside as well.
And right, yes, yeah.
And those are the passions. Sometimes you're moved by reason. Sometimes you're moved by an ice cream cone.
Yeah, but the complexity of the question is this, which I hadn't thought of before. Would we want to say that there's a conatus of reason and a conatus of passion, and they're fighting each other? That doesn't sound right. No, there's one conatus. And
yeah, that one conatus is the conatus that resulted if we subtract something from the total, as when we compose forces, you know, with the parallelogram rule, or
But is my conatus sort of divisible into conatus lends affective power both to my rational beliefs, my rational ideas, and to my passionate affects. But how does it do that? Does it divide itself so that it's working against itself? I don't know how to answer that. I'm sure somebody in this gallery knows how to answer that. But
so if you want, if people in the gallery wants to answer, we are recording answer. Meanwhile, I want to introduce a question from the YouTube. Eric Jones is introducing the questions we haven't discussed so far. What's the connection between human and divine reason? And is this too a source of optimism?
Between human and divine reason.
Is there such a thing as divine reason?
Yeah, I don't think so.
I think to think of God in an anthropomorphic way, which Spinoza would reject.
Can we then perhaps rephrase it in terms of your book, Steve, and think you are saying something extremely interesting about how is it that that people who are more trained, they go through this training and they learn how to live according to reason, and they produce more knowledge of the second and the third kind, are implicitly what are you saying there? The surviving reason, or whatever leaves after them in terms of surviving reason, is bigger. I don't remember exactly the right phrase that you are saying there. That somehow, as the knowledge that we produce somehow leaves after us. This is the only way in which Spinoza talks about immortality. But there is a kind of difference of degree between those who do produce more second and third knowledge of the second and the third kind and the others.
Yes. So what's left behind is also what was there beforehand and what persists during this lifetime because it's eternal. And so to the extent that
so maybe we can translate the question in these terms, not in the terms of a God that is personal or something, but in these terms that you are talking about in your book.
So sorry, can you just remind me what the question itself is?
Whether there is a sort of external pull, not only the internal pull of the conatus, but something, the external pull of a divine reason or something else that is pulling there.
Well, there is so external to me in a sense, in that there's a great deal more knowledge out there to be had than I have. One way I like to think of it is that God or nature is like a Wi-Fi router, and all this information is there to be had. And each of us is a little laptop computer. And when we tap into that Wi-Fi, we can download that information, which becomes a part of our memory banks, part of our hard drives. And for the duration of our lives, we embrace this knowledge. It is a part of our minds. And when I die, my laptop fails, it gets recycled. Well, no recycling for Spinoza. It disintegrates, but the router is still sending, all that information is still out there, and that's eternal. There is also, and here's how we could speak of God's conatus. I am just going back to the question about individuals earlier. I am a finite parcel of conatus or striving, and what I'm a finite parcel of is the infinite parcel of power that is God or nature. Because Spinoza says God's essence is power. And so there is this striving of nature as a whole, of which my striving forms one unit, and every individual's striving is a unit. And this infinite, eternal striving of nature manifests itself in the physical world as bodies in motion, or as the principles of bodies in motion. And it manifests itself in the world of thought as ideas, eternal, adequate ideas, which is what Spinoza calls God's intellect, which contains all ideas of all things, all possible things. And to the extent that I tap into that body of knowledge, I am participating in God's mind to an extent. But it's not as Dan said, it's not a personal God. It's not it is a kind of reward for virtue, but not in a providential sense, but rather because I'm living the virtuous life, which is the pursuit of understanding. The natural result of that is that I improve my condition, not because God has elevated me through some divine fiat, but because through my own resources, I've taken advantage of the opportunities that nature gives me to make my life better and to make the lives of others better.
There's a question on YouTube on this from Colin Phillips. Would knowledge of the second and third kind be divine reason, meaning absolute certain intellect of nature? And would this be similar to active or agent intellect in Jewish thought?
I like that analogy. So just to clarify for listeners, take my Maimonides as an example, or paradigm for medieval Jewish thought, the active or agent intellect, as I read Maimonides and also Gersonides, is the knowledge that emanates from God down through the celestial spheres. It's again an eternal, infinite body of knowledge, the Creator's knowledge of the cosmos. And I think Spinoza's defect should, at least in its content, be analogous to that. I think that's a nice analogy. And let me say a little bit more. And for Maimonides, to the extent that my acquired intellect, that is the body of knowledge that I end up having in my mind, represents or reflects this knowledge emanating down from God, I think that's similar to the way in which, for Spinoza, the human mind becomes eternal by embodying or embracing this eternal knowledge that's there to be had. So I think there's a lot to be learned by comparing Spinoza, especially part 5 of the Ethics is so difficult, and it has caused so many people to tear out their hair and make intemperate comments about Spinoza having lost his way, or having now feared for his immortal soul, or having finally found religion. That's because they're not reading part 5 of the Ethics in its proper context, which is the context of medieval Jewish rationalism. And there we see Spinoza in a kind of dialogue with people like Maimonides and Gersonides, perhaps taking their views to their ultimate logical conclusion. Maybe not a conclusion, certainly not a conclusion that Maimonides or Gersonides would endorse. But then again, I think Maimonides and Gersonides were very unorthodox in this, and were themselves somewhat skeptical about the notion of personal immortality.
I think, to be fair, it's just Jonathan Bennett who takes that position. But it's a nice position for us all to argue against.
Right. There's not a straw man, but there's just one. There's one real one.
We'll have to talk about this later. I would put the relationship between us and God and question of reason in nature and in God and in us in a somewhat different way, but that gets into real technicalities that I think we shouldn't get into. But can I suggest that we move to we've been talking about life. Let's talk about death for a while, which is another, I think, important theme.
Can we, before talking about death, we have 2 questions, one from Shin Butler and the other one, a finger from Bill Eaton, maybe just to finish the God part of the discussion, and then death. So Sean, and then Bill Eaton.
Yes, hi. And I didn't mean for this to be particularly a question for discussion so much as just a comment on something that was said in the moment about, it seems to me that the divine intellect is existence itself. But I think I would much rather just defer and talk about death for a little while than have my question answered. Thank you very much.
Right. Bill?
I'm looking forward to death too. But it just occurred to me that maybe there isn't just very quickly, maybe there isn't a divine rationality or something, but any rational thought is ultimately going to be a mode of God. And secondly, just very, very quickly, what Stephen said of his laptop analogy seems similar to me to Malebranche, like in the sense that when we entertain or contemplate some mathematical truth, for instance, in some sense, we're kind of communing with the divine mind. But that's all I wanted to say.
Except, so here, I like that. It's nice. Although I would say for Malebranche, it's more like the cloud, because the information doesn't come down. It stays up there. You just,
oh, that's great. That's great.
You see into it.
But isn't that true of Spinoza as well? I mean, when we have, say, when we have an idea of a geometrical theorem, it's not as if it's being downloaded into our laptop, which then can, be junked later on. We are literally sharing that idea with God.
Yeah, fair enough. It's just that with Malebranche's God, there's a there.
Yeah.
Right, and now to death.
Thank you.
Let me just say here something, namely that again we have this. We started with the differences between Seneca and the Stoics and the tradition, and how revolutionary he is. Now here, you make him sound really revolutionary, because unlike a whole tradition of philosophers who think that death is the most important moment of our life, Seneca for once, Epictetus second, and so on. Although arguing for spiritual exercises or, for spiritual training, Spinoza really claims that we should not think about death. Why not?
So, yeah. So let me just slightly tweak that. It's not that he's saying we should not think about death, but rather, because you don't find a lot of shoulds or oughts here, but rather to the extent that you become more free, you will think less about death. The contrast you draw with the Stoics is absolutely right. Seneca, I believe it was, who says, think constantly of death. That's the best way to deal with it. Whereas the Epicurean, here I think Spinoza is closer to the Epicureans, who famously said, where death is, I am not, and where I am, death is not. So there's nothing to think about. And the question is, what's the appropriate attitude to take towards one's death? And what Spinoza sees is that among most people, their vision of their impending or distant dooms is one of hope and fear. Hope for eternal reward, fear of eternal punishment, or at least hope for painless death and fear that it might be something worse than that. And of course, this is a life of bondage. Once again, you're enslaved to the passions. What the free person knows is that when you're dead, you're dead. There is no world to come. There is no afterlife. There is no place of eternal reward and no domain of eternal punishment. So there's nothing to hope for and nothing to fear. And so the free person doesn't ponder their death because first of all, there's nothing there to ponder. And secondly, because their focus is on this life, on the joy of, I'll say the joy of living. That is the joy that they get through their awareness of their power, and that through their experience of the increase in their power, that their life of virtue and rationality and freedom and understanding brings them, which really leaves them no time or no room to think about nothingness and to obsess over what happens to death. So what's the appropriate attitude to take towards death? It's not hope, it's not fear, it's not anxiety. It is what it is. And
let me present an alternative perspective on this by a different contemporary whose name has come up at least once, and that's Pascal. For Pascal, it is something that his response to Spinoza would be, you are thinking about life just to avoid confronting what is actually the most important event, in your life, which is when it is that it ends. And the possibility, he certainly takes into account the possibility that there may be nothing afterwards. But he also thinks we have to take into account the possibility that we're wrong. This is the wager, right, of course. But he thinks that why do we gamble? Why do we hunt? Why do we seek all of these diversions? It's just to avoid thinking about death and trying to figure out how it is that we should deal with that. Right. What would Spinoza say to Pascal?
I think so. When Pascal says the only good thing in this life is the hope of another life, there is no more unspinozistic comment in the 17th century.
I'm not sure that he necessarily believes that. He takes into account the possibility that, what he actually does say is we should act as if we believed in God, and eventually the belief will come, and we may even then be wrong.
But I'm reading right from the Pensées here. He says, let us ponder these things and then say whether it is not beyond doubt that the only good thing in this life is the hope of another life, and that we become happy only as we come nearer to it. And that just as no more unhappiness awaits those who have been quite certain of eternity, so there's no happiness for those who have no inkling of it.
But you get rid of the fear, you also get rid of the hope.
At what point?
Well, this is I'm talking about Spinoza.
Oh yeah, yes, yes.
You get rid of the fear, but
you get rid of the hope.
rid of the hope. And what Spinoza is arguing for, in a way, is a life without hope.
That sounds so hopeless.
Exactly. This is, I'm putting this out for discussion, not necessarily because I don't think Spinoza is right, but the thing is but it's an interesting thing. It's a feature, I mean, in which what Spinoza is saying here is enormously radical.
Yes.
Is, because certainly an important feature of many religions has been hope as something that should be not eliminated, but cultivated. And if we follow Spinoza, then we are living without fear, which is good, but we're also living without hope as well.
Even in mundane matters, like when, we sometimes it's said that Spinoza's egoistic motivation for ethical behavior is do unto others as you would have others do unto you. No, that's not right, because the golden rule is based on hope. That is, you will hope others will treat you the way you treat them. Spinoza's free person is not hoping that other people's will. The free person knows what's going to come through certain modes of behavior. So yeah, I think, so now are you suggesting, Dan, that a life without hope is not a life that we should strive for? That this is a check against Spinoza?
Well, it's something that if you accept Spinoza's view, it does mean living without hope altogether. The other feature, I think, in Pascal is the idea that you can find as well in Hobbes, and this is a striking difference between Hobbes and Spinoza. The fear of death is a major is what's behind the conatus. Right, we strive for self-preservation because we fear death, and we fear death above all. Right, and that's why we do what we do, is to avoid as long as possible death. And Pascal does think that we, that. I mean, this is his theme about diversions, is that our lives are ways of avoiding having to think about death.
It makes Pascal sound like the first existentialist. That is the
well, in a certain sense, he is. Yeah, I mean, this is not the first. He has been interpreted in that way.
Right.
But it really is true that he does believe that a great deal of our activity is so that we can avoid thinking about having to think about death. And his alternative is we should confront it directly. And he thinks, and eventually become Christians.
Let me say one word in favor of a life without hope. Because if, at least in Spinoza's understanding of hope, it's based on uncertainty and a desire for either a counterfactual situation or a lack of understanding. But a life without hope is not necessarily a life without anticipation, expectation, or even a life without desire. It's just that these desires and anticipations and expectations are grounded in knowledge and not uncertainty. Now, maybe there's a great deal of value to uncertainty. Most of us would not want to know when we're going to die or how we're going to die. And if all these tests that were being offered now, genetic tests about whether we might carry the gene for Alzheimer's or some other disease, would we really want to know? And the answer is probably no, we would not. I think there's value both in a lack of informed anticipation, which is really what hope is.
Yeah, but look, I mean, even Spinoza would think, certainly we think everything is necessary, but we don't know what exactly it is that's going to happen. There's still going to be uncertainty, even for the free man.
Yeah.
We know that we're going to die, but we don't know when, we don't know how, we don't know whether it's going to be in our sleep or in a painful way, you know, and so
perhaps the free man will have hope and fear, but just will not be guided by them. They won't let their hopes and fears consume their lives or direct their actions. I don't know.
How about saying that we should be strongly suspicious of hope? I mean, that's the attitude that, for example, Seneca argues for. But you know, I mean, there is this in Seneca and some of the Roman Stoics, there is this idea that hope is strongly connected with self-deceit and fear, and we should live without hope. But the solution for living without hope for them is to contemplate death.
Right. Yeah, that's a solution that Spinoza would not allow for. But you know, if Dan's right that even the free person can't understand with certainty every outcome.
Of course he can't. I think even Spinoza, the free person is not omniscient.
No, it's correct. So I should say right. So Dan is right. Even the free person will not have absolute clarity of vision on every outcome. And so even the free person will have to have some hopes. But again, going back to what I was saying earlier, these hopes cannot be directing the free person. And yet now that I say that, that seems wrong, because even the free person will know that they have to act in situations of uncertainty.
Yeah. But the thing is, in particular, what the particular hope that Spinoza wants to get rid of is the hope for an eternal life in paradise.
Right, of course.
And the fear of eternal damnation.
Right. These are the most pernicious of all superstitious beliefs, because they so infect your entire life. And they cause not just the psychological bondage to the passions, but they generate political and social bondage to ecclesiastics. So if I'm living my life in hope and fear, I'm going to throw myself at the mercy of a rabbi, a priest, or pastor who's going to tell me that, oh yes, they know the way to get to heaven and avoid hell.
Well, let's return to Pascal and the wager. And Pascal will say, well, even a rational person is going to, I don't know, Spinoza may have an answer to this. But I think what he does say is, look, even a perfectly rational person, first of all, reason can't tell us whether or not God in the personal sense, not Spinoza's God, but God in the personal sense of an anthropomorphic God who will reward or punish after death, whether or not that God exists. And as long as there is even the slightest positive chance, it's rational for us to want to believe in such a non-Spinozistic God.
And yeah.
And what Spinoza's answer has got to be that such a conception of God is incoherent.
Yeah. I mean, the irrationality of the conception of God at the foundation of that attitude undermines the rationality of the attitude itself. I mean, it can't be that you have a rational expectation that's based on an irrational belief, an incoherent belief.
Spinoza sort of presents a different conception of God.
A little bit, you think?
Yeah, I think so. But then the real question is it a conception of God at all?
Now we get to the nub, right?
Yeah. And
You're pushing me, Dan.
I mean, ultimately, this is what the question comes to.
Yeah.
Is one could say that Spinoza is, in a certain sense, betting within Pascal's wager that God doesn't exist.
Right. Except his bet is based on a rational demonstration.
It's based on a rational demonstration, but I mean, is it a demonstration of atheism, or
Right.
is it simply a demonstration that there is, a unique substance that is the subject, in a certain sense, of all of the modes? Now we're getting into the technical.
Can I just jump in? Yeah, can I just jump in to lower down the discussion to the earth? I apologize, but just to say that that we are talking here about two philosophical conceptions of God. I do not see why Spinoza doesn't have a God just because he doesn't have a personal God. I mean, Seneca again has a very good conception of God, which is the spiritus of the world. And actually, and Bill Eaton had a number of questions that I think are relating to this particular point. So maybe Bill wants to put them.
Oh, I'm sorry. They were just kind of passing comments. I think you nailed it, Dana.
Well, let me respond to that. So I'm pointing that way because Dana in this
Bill,
gallery,
who do you
Dana
think nailed it?
Right there.
Dana, yeah, just because you don't have a personal God doesn't mean you don't have a God at all. So yeah, I think the traditional charge of atheism to Spinoza is misguided.
Well, let me be misguided for a minute then. Because all right, so let's have at it. We all agree that there is no transcendent providential God for Spinoza, no personal God, right? So that's off the table.
Right.
Well, what have you got then? You've got an infinite eternal substance with infinite eternal attributes. Fine.
And that ain't bad.
What?
And
That's
that
not
ain't bad.
It ain't bad. It does a lot. It explains a lot. However, why call this? Well, I'm not going to say why call this God. Why think of this as a God in any meaningful sense? And here's what I mean. And let's contrast it with the way in which Spinoza is so often read as a pantheist. Because if he's not a providential, transcendent theist, but he still somehow has a conception of God, it's got to be a pantheistic God. So here's my case. The pantheist, and I don't want to, I'll use the term atheist, but again, atheist is an anachronistic term. It doesn't appear in the 17th century in the sense in which we regard it, or it's not always regarded that way. And it's such an all-purpose label for people who disagree with you, the way in which communist or today socialist is a meaningless label that you simply give to people who happen
or even Hobbesian back then.
Or Hobbesian or Spinozist, right? The worst label would be the Spinozist.
Or even Cartesian.
Well, now it's getting personal. Or Socinian. I mean, all of these labels, they're thrown around in the 17th century. But I'm going to use the word atheist with this caveat. Now, the two times that Spinoza denies being an atheist, on the first occasion, he says, well, they wouldn't call me an atheist if they knew the kind of life I led. Namely, there, Spinoza, atheist means lascivious, immoral, and wicked. And he says, well, I'm not an atheist. The other occasion, he says, they shouldn't call me atheist because I believe in the true religion. But for Spinoza, the true religion is just treating other people with justice and charity. So you have the pantheist and you have the atheist, and they agree that all there is nature. So what's the difference between the pantheist and the atheist? Well, the pantheist must believe there's something truly divine about nature in the sense that nature is deserving of worshipful awe, religious reverence, or something. I just don't understand what kind of sense to make a pantheism if it's not that. But that's not Spinoza's view. Spinoza does not think, and he uses this phrase, he does not think we should gape at nature like fools. He does not think that nature is deserving of worshipful awe or religious reverence. The proper attitude to take towards nature is understanding, knowledge, a deep investigation of nature's ways, not its purposes, but its laws and states of affairs. So what remains of God? Nothing. I don't see anything truly godlike about Spinoza's nature except infinity and eternity. And to my mind, those two do not amount to God.
Well, I mean, not God of the not
Right, Mike.
Pascal's God, not Pascal's God. But if you
Not
think of
anybody's
the
God.
well, no, I mean, if you think of the spiritus of Seneca and the Stoics, that's exactly what it is.
Well, no, the
And why
spiritus
that is a God?
It's not. The
And
spiritus
you
of the
know,
Stoics.
there is one thing. There
The
is one thing I think you need still to explain, namely that there is a sort of pool of this divine nature expressed in the intellectual love of God and expressed into the hierarchy of knowledges that we produce. So there is some sort of outside pool that I respond to when I strive to know more, isn't it?
I'd have to disagree, first of all, with the analogy with the Stoic spiritus or Zeus or Logos, because the Stoic Zeus is a teleological power. It has purposes. Nature exists for the sake of whatever it may be. There is none of that in Spinoza. God or nature, Deus sive natura, is not anything you would look to for comfort or reassurance or meaning.
That's actually true of Descartes' God. In a certain way, it's true of the God that's proved in St. Thomas's Five Ways. It's the God of the philosophers.
But Descartes' God, first of all, is a creator, and secondly, Descartes' God has providential purposes.
It's true.
How about taking the providential purposes apart and saying, okay, there are no providential purposes, but what there is the attractive power of reason or divine reason, or, you know,
Magnets have attractive power.
Yeah, and they are very powerful in kind of making a needle's act. So the question is there a drive? Is there an external drive that makes me become a better man? Or is all internal?
There's an internal drive. It's what you are.
I should say about the question of atheism in Spinoza, that I don't think it's actually a question worth debating, because the terms of what counts as a God and what counts as atheism is very, very vague. And as Steve pointed out, you know, within the context of 17th century philosophy, for example, among Spinoza's contemporaries, atheism was used more as a polemical term than it was as a substantive claim. You know, from the point of view of the Catholics, the Lutherans were atheists.
That's why I try to reformulate everything in terms of drive, and I'm glad that Erin has joined the discussion, because she earlier had a definition of conatus, and now she has something to say about external and internal drive. So Erin, do you want to say it?
I mean, I can say it. I think I don't want to get into the weeds, which I am always at risk of doing when I'm talking about Spinoza. But if you understand the drive is to survive, and what you're doing when you do it rationally is by understanding the world around you. The drive is internal to you, but you're understanding the things around you. The difference between a passion and an adequate idea, as far as I understand it, is understanding it properly. So when I understand someone who's made me feel bad, like someone hurt my feelings, it's a passion if I've misunderstood what's going on, and it's an adequate idea if I understand the chain of events that led up to them behaving in the way that hurt my feelings. And so the drive is internal, but you can't, you feed that drive and you get better at acting rationally and acting on the basis of reason and acquiring adequate ideas about the world. That's entirely dependent on the world. and understanding it.
Are you suggesting, though, that the fact that I have this drive is fundamentally dependent on the external world?
Well, I don't know that you're coherent out if you don't understand it. I don't know what it would mean for Spinoza for an individual to have an idea of themselves that didn't involve the affects, which are passive. So, yes.
Okay. So,
I mean, I think but my conception, and this is what Dana was pointing to before, my understanding of the conatus is there's like a principle which applies to everything in the world, or is just a principle of existence, which is the conatus principle, which is that we all strive. And the thing that differentiates us in our individual striving is this composition of adequate and inadequate ideas that makes me who I am. I have a bunch of different ideas about what's around me, these plants that are around me, this screen that I'm looking at, and that's part of those ideas make up my mind, and some of them are adequate and some of them are inadequate, and all of them, inadequate and adequate, inform my striving. So the principle is different from the actualization of it.
Okay. So, I mean, I think your question gets to the heart of a problem in Spinoza, going back to what we were talking about earlier on individuation. Are there individuals outside of their concrete causal interactions with other finite things? I think, so I entirely agree with you that the modifications of conatus are dependent. No, sorry, that's not true. I was going to say that the modifications of conatus are dependent on external things, but there are some modifications of conatus that come from within, from my knowledge. But would we have individuals, that is, individual strivings of conatus, outside of the durational concrete interactions we have with external things? And the way you describe it, it sounds like the answer to that is no. And I think there's a good case to be made for that. At the same time, I think that, as I understand Spinoza, each of us, besides being durationally existent individuals, there's an essence for every individual. And so there must be a way of individuating essences of individuals outside of our durational existence, which relies on conatus.
I mean, I will say my own reading of Spinoza has an answer for that, and that's the actual essence. But that's because I think that there's a categorical difference between formal essence and actual essence, and I think that might be diving into the weeds more.
Yeah, but it's an interesting dive, but maybe we shouldn't take it here. But I have to say that the distinction between formal and actual essences, for me, has always been a somewhat opaque one. So I'd be interested in hearing how you distinguish them. So Noah asked an interesting question too, which is actually not unrelated to this. She says, it seems that you, that is me, you are equating the divine with creative power, that is the power to create finite substances. Is your point then that since finite created substances are incoherent, so is something like Spinoza's God? What do you mean finite created substances are incoherent? Do you mean because there's no creation?
Yeah, right. I would have thought the whole point of part one of the ethics, right, was to show that you can't have created substances. It's something is either created or a substance. But the notion of a created substance is incoherent. And then if you're going to say you only get to have God as long as he creates and has something like created substances, then it would be like, yeah, of course there isn't a God for Spinoza, because you're sort of, it would be the inverse of that.
I guess I'm not sure I would make creating substances an essential feature a priori for a God. Let's say you're Maimonides, for example, who may be read as saying that the universe is eternal, like a good Aristotelian, but nonetheless reflects some providential plan of God who is not its creator.
Why,
Either that, and I-
Noah, can I
Yeah.
just ask you,
yeah.
isn't it enough to talk about creating things? Why do they have to be substances? That's a particular term of art.
Yeah, that's true.
Spinoza uses in a way that's somewhat different than the way in which other people use it. And there's a motivation for why he does. But
Yeah.
would it be enough to simply say, and Spinoza does say that God is the efficient cause
Yeah.
of everything,
Yeah.
things and not substances.
But I think what I gathered from Steve, and it might not be right, that there's that the kind of dependence that things have on God somehow depends on God's will or something like that to get the providence going, and then also making the fear of death make sense because there can be a real annihilation and that. But the minute that we say that kind of relation is incoherent, right? Then if you want to say there still might be something like divine, then I don't see why you want to say Spinoza can't have something divine. Like why infinity and eternality isn't enough. Now you have causal power, you have eternality, you have infinity. The only thing that isn't there is the possibility of annihilation.
To me, infinity and eternity just don't cut it. Mathematical truths, the set of numbers is eternal and infinite, perhaps. I don't know. I don't have the philosophy of mathematics. Does that make mathematics divine?
Well,
There's got to be more to God than just eternity and infinity. If that's all there is to God, then I give up. Then yes, you're right. Spinoza has a God, a real God.
But this is
but
exactly
no, let me make it like put it like this. Is it a requirement on your side for a God that if there is a God, he better be able to annihilate?
No, I don't think so.
No, I think this is exactly my point. It isn't clear what it is that constitutes being a God anyway, which is part of the reason why it is that the debate about is Spinoza an atheist or not is not well defined in a certain sense.
But could we distinguish that
We're
from the
coming
debate?
to the end.
Oh.
And there are a lot of questions that people have raised, and I'm very sorry that we can't get them, that we didn't have an opportunity to discuss everything. But this has been marvelous fun. Donna asked me to sort of summarize in a couple of words what it is that we've been doing, and I think for me, I think the theme has been Spinoza is an enormously, when you understand him correctly, Spinoza is really an enormously compelling thinker, and particularly about these issues about the life to lead, which is properly what it is that ethics is. Aaron points out that he's definitely wrong about
Yes.
absolutely. That goes without saying, but that in many ways he's still a very compelling thinker, but that there are still interesting questions that one can raise, interesting questions that alternative views that we need to consider, and that the answer in the end, winds up being more conversation. Steve, do you have a response to that?
I just want to add my gratitude to Dana and Dan for having me join this forum, and my gratitude to all of you all for your questions. If questions that didn't get answered or didn't get adequately answered, I want to encourage, like, if you want to talk more about God or formal versus actual essences, please feel free to email me. I'd be happy to carry on that conversation because there's only so much we can do in 2 hours. but I'm really grateful for this opportunity. So thanks to everybody.
And thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve, so much. So if we have to summarize in 2 words what you have learned tonight, well, I have certainly learned that Seneca is a key moral philosopher who read and reflected upon previous philosophers and who is very interestingly connected and also different from the Stoic tradition. That he reflected upon previous answers on how to put together our conflicting impulses, but also the conflicting impulses of the human being, the self-preservation with sociability. And also, it looked like from our discussion tonight that Steve is saying that Spinoza was able to put his metaphysics in service of the moral philosophy. Steve, would you agree with this last point?
100%. And I think the book has the title Ethics for a reason. And when people teach Spinoza and only read parts 1 and 2 in a history of modern philosophy course, the students are left wondering, why the hell is this book called Ethics? And Spinoza is treated disrespectfully as a mere stepping stone on the way from Descartes to Leibniz or whoever else it may be. And I think we don't do justice. He is, both the ethics and the TTP are part of the same moral and political project. And we shouldn't overlook those aspects of Spinoza's philosophy. The metaphysics is there to serve the moral philosophy and to help people live better lives.
Fantastic. So now everyone goes and reads Steve's book, and I'm sure there will be more conversations on.
And I hope that we all lead a better life because of this.
I'm sure we will, starting from tomorrow. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you
Thanks
very
so much.
It was a fantastic discussion. Thank you all.
That was great. Thank you.
See you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.